I was sitting at the table when my daughter-in-law stood up during Christmas dinner and proclaimed the toast. My father is a more successful lawyer. My father-in-law is just our old servant. She laughed together with the 12 guests, convinced she'd finally broken me. But what I did next made everyone go silent. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel where we tell stories of husbands and wives taking revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Raymond Gardner. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house I built, not with my own hands, but with 35 years of careful decisions and the kind of patience that only comes from spending your career designing things meant to last. I was a commercial architect. People hired me because they trusted my judgment. I never had a reason to doubt it until I let someone into my house. The house at 1847 Ridgecrest Drive is a 4-bedroom colonial with a detached garage I converted into a woodworking shop 6 years ago. Charlotte's suburbs in this neighborhood are quiet, manicured lawns, neighbors who wave but don't pry. I bought this property decades ago when the price was a fraction of what it is now. I know every wall, every beam, every square foot of its $9,200,000 of assessed worth. I know it the way you know something you chose deliberately. My son Brandon is 37 years old. He has my jaw and somewhere along the way developed a spine made entirely of warm mozzarella. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's the most precise description I have. Brandon was a good kid. I remember when he was 9 years old and his soccer team lost the championship game by 1 goal. He cried for 4 minutes, then said, "Okay, Dad. Next year." That boy had something, a quiet toughness. I used to think it would carry him through anything. Then he married Nicole. Nicole Whitfield, Nicole Gardner now, though she uses that name the way someone wears a borrowed coat, came into our lives 3 years ago with a smile that could light up a room and eyes that were always calculating its square footage. She's 34, beautiful, in a way she is very aware of and possessed of the absolute certainty that she deserves more than whatever she currently has. Her father, Daniel Whitfield, is a family and estate attorney with 30 years of practice and the kind of self-satisfaction that only comes from decades of people telling you how impressive you are. Nicole grew up in the Whitfield house where success was measured in billable hours and zip codes. She married my son because she loved him. She stayed in my house because she had a plan. I didn't see it at first. When Brandon called and asked if they could stay with me. "Just for a few months, Dad. While we get settled," I said yes, without hesitation. That's what you do. That's what a father does. I cleared out the guest suite, bought new bedding, made space in the kitchen cabinets. I was happy to have the house full again. It had been quiet for too long. The first sign came about 3 weeks in. I came downstairs to find the living room rearranged. My reading chair, brown leather, positioned exactly where the morning light came through the east window, had been moved to the corner near the staircase. A decorative bench sat in its place, the kind of furniture that looks impressive and is completely useless for sitting. "Hope you don't mind," Nicole said from the kitchen, not looking up. "It just flows better this way." I minded. I moved my chair back that afternoon. The next morning it was in the corner again. Let it stay. That's the thing about small surrenders. They don't feel like surrenders at the time. They feel like flexibility, like being the bigger person. I told myself she's adjusting, making a new home feel like her own. The thoughts of a man still operating under the assumption that basic decency would eventually reassert itself. It didn't. Over the following months, Nicole settled into the house the way a new owner would. She replaced the kitchen towels. Mine were apparently too old. She reorganized the pantry for efficiency, which meant I spent 3 weeks unable to find the coffee filters. She had opinions about the thermostat, about the porch light, about which bathroom guests should use. And she had a particular gift for discussing these opinions with other people while I was in the room, as though I were a piece of furniture that might overhear but couldn't possibly object. One afternoon in September, I came home from a walk to find my magazines stacked on the recycling bin. Architectural Digest, a legal commentary journal I'd subscribed to for 8 years. 3 issues of fine woodworking I hadn't finished. Nicole was in the kitchen making tea. "Those were mine," I said. "They were cluttering the side table," she said pleasantly. "The current issues are on the shelf." They were all current issues. She looked at me with that patient expression she reserved for moments when she felt I was missing the point. "Raymond, I just think the common areas should stay tidy. You have your workshop if you need space for your things. My workshop in my garage in my house. Yes. Thank you for that, Nicole. Brandon was in the doorway. He looked at the recycling bin. He looked at his wife. He looked at me. And then he said nothing and walked away. I have turned that moment over many times since. Not with anger exactly, but with the clinical curiosity of a man examining a structural failure, trying to identify exactly when the load-bearing element gave way. By early December, I had learned to move through my own house with the particular care of a man who has been quietly told repeatedly, without actual words, that he is a guest. Nicole had taken over planning the Christmas dinner. List, color scheme, seating arrangement. She mentioned the guest list in passing. 12 people. Mostly her friends and colleagues, plus her father Daniel. I asked about the Hendersons, from 3 doors down, neighbors I'd known for 20 years who'd been at my table every Christmas for a decade. I think it's better to keep it curated, Nicole said. Curated, in my house. A week before the dinner, I was in the kitchen when I heard her on the phone. Yes, just come to our house, she said. We're on Ridgecrest Drive. We've really made it our own. I stood very still for a moment. Then I poured my coffee and went to my workshop. And then 4 days before Christmas, I got a text from Brandon. I was at the workbench fitting the dovetail joint when my phone buzzed. Dad, Nikki's asking if you could just help with the table setting and maybe stay in the background during dinner. She wants it to flow. Don't want any awkwardness. Thanks. I set the phone down on the bench. I looked at the piece of oak I'd been working on. A picture frame. Simple design. Clean lines. I picked up the chisel. I kept working. I didn't reply, but I was thinking. For the first time in 3 years, I was really, truly thinking. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was upset, or not only because of that, but because once a certain kind of thinking starts, it doesn't stop until it's finished. I lay in bed with the ceiling above me and began systematically to inventory the last 3 years. The furniture, the magazines, the neighbors. Not invited, the phone call about our house. The text from my son asking me to stay in the background at a dinner table I had owned since before he could drive. And then I remembered something else. Something I had pushed aside 6 months ago because I hadn't wanted to examine it too closely. It was a Sunday in June. Nicole had come into my study, knocked, which was unusual, holding a folder. She was pleasant that day, warm even. She said Daniel had been helping them think through some family financial planning, and there was just one document she needed me to sign. Something to do with the homeowner's insurance policy, she said. A co-insured addendum, she called it. It was just a formality. I asked to read it. She smiled. It's just standard language. I said I'd read it first. She left the folder. I sat down and went through it slowly. It was not a co-insured addendum. It was a partial ownership claim document, not legally binding as presented. Missing several required elements under North Carolina property law, but clearly the skeleton of something that, with the right follow-up filings, could have established a joint interest claim on the property. Daniel's fingerprints were all over the language. The kind of document a family law attorney drafts when he thinks the other party doesn't know what they're looking at. I put it back in the folder and left it on the kitchen counter. I never mentioned it. Nicole never asked about it again. I filed the memory away and told myself I was probably reading too much into things. Lying in the dark that December night, I understood I had not been reading too much into things. I got up at 6:00 the morning and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. I still think better on paper. And wrote down 3 things. What I owned, what I had agreed to explicitly in writing, and what I had never agreed to but had allowed through silence and patience and a misplaced faith that things would sort themselves out. The house was mine, fully legally and entirely mine. I had purchased it outright. There was no mortgage, no joint tenancy, no community property claim. North Carolina is not a community property state, and even if it were, Brandon and Nicole were not married to me. The title held my name and my name only. The deed was in the fireproof safe in my closet, exactly where it had always been. But the document from June told me something important. Nicole knew this. She knew the house was mine. And she had already taken one step to try to change that, which meant she was thinking about it, planning around it. And Daniel, with 30 years of estate law practice, was helping her. I thought about Brandon. I thought about him the way you think about someone you love and are disappointed in simultaneously, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable kind of thinking there is. He was not a bad man. I believe that completely. But he had let this happen. Every time he had a choice between saying something and saying nothing, he had chosen nothing. The text message was not an aberration. It was the accumulated weight of 3 years of small silences. I remembered the summer he turned 12. We drove to the Outer Banks, just the two of us. A fishing trip, 4 days. Nothing fancy. It rained for 2 of the 4 days. We played cards and ate sandwiches and talked about everything and nothing. On the drive home, he fell asleep in the passenger seat, and I remember thinking, this kid is going to be all right. Whatever comes at him, he'll find his footing. I had been wrong about that, or at least partially wrong. He'd found his footing. He'd just given it to someone else to stand on. I finished my coffee. I opened my laptop and went to the North Carolina State Bar Association website. I needed a real property attorney, not a family friend, not someone who knew the whole complicated history. Someone clean, professional, with no stake in the outcome. Someone who would look at the situation the way I looked at blueprints, objectively, with attention to what was actually there, rather than what people hoped was there. I found a name, Timothy Hall, Real Property and Estate Planning Office on South Tryon Street. 12 years in practice, board certified, the kind of biography that says capable without overreaching. I called his office when it opened and spoke to his assistant. She asked what the matter concerned. Property protection, I said, irrevocable living trust and possibly an occupancy agreement. She put me on hold for 40 seconds. When she came back, she said Mr. Hall had an opening the next morning at 9:00. I'll be there, I said. I hung up and sat for a moment at the kitchen table. I could hear movement upstairs, Nicole getting up. The sound of her footsteps crossing the floor above me was so familiar by now that I could track her path. Bathroom, closet, hallway. My house with its sounds, its light, its rhythms. Mine to know that intimately. The thought arrived quietly, without drama. This is the last time she makes that walk without understanding exactly what it means. That evening I was back in the workshop. The picture frame I'd been building was nearly done. A simple rectangle of white oak, hand-cut joints, smooth as river stone. I turned it in my hands under the workbench light, checking the corners. Architecture had taught me many things, but woodworking had taught me the one thing. Architecture sometimes forgets that the piece you're building has to work for you, not the other way around. You don't adjust your hands to a bad joint. You fix the joint. I set the frame down and looked at the wall above my workbench, where I keep a few things that matter to me. A photograph from a project I was proud of. A community art center in Raleigh. Finished on time and under budget. A small watercolor Brandon had painted in the 3rd grade, framed badly, slightly crooked. I'd never straightened it. I picked up a small piece of sandpaper and started smoothing the last rough edge of the frame. The motion was steady, familiar. I wasn't thinking about Christmas dinner or seating arrangements or text messages anymore. I was thinking about foundations, about what makes a structure sound, about how, when you design something correctly from the start, it holds against pressure, against time, against people who don't understand what they're standing on. I had an appointment in the morning. For the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to tomorrow. The office of Timothy Hall was on the 5th floor of a building on South Tryon Street. Glass and steel, the kind of mid-rise that architects of my generation built in the 80s, and that cities keep standing because replacing them costs more than tolerating them. I took the elevator up, gave my name to the assistant at the front desk, and sat in a chair that probably cost more than most people's couches. There was a stack of legal periodicals on the side table. I picked one up. I was still reading when Hall appeared in the doorway. He was younger than I expected, mid-40s, lean, with the focused, unhurried manner of someone who understood that confidence didn't require rushing. He shook my hand once firmly and led me into his office. No small talk about the weather. I appreciated that. You said property protection, he said, settling into his chair. Tell me what you're working with, I told him. Not the emotional history, he didn't need that, but the structural facts. House on Ridgecrest Drive, sole owner, no mortgage deed in my name exclusively. 2 adults living with me for 3 years under no formal written agreement. 1 documented attempt, 6 months prior, to get me to sign a partial ownership claim document that had been misrepresented as a coinsurance addendum. I laid it out the way I would have walked a client through a building site. Here is the foundation. Here are the walls. Here is where the problem is. Hall listened without interrupting. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he took 3 notes during my entire explanation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at what he'd written. "The document they tried to get you to sign," he said. "Do you still have it?" "I have a photograph of it." I took one before I put it back in the folder. He looked up, the faintest shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but something adjacent. "Good. That tells me a few things." He set down his pen. "Mr. Gardner, what you're describing is a fairly straightforward situation under North Carolina property law, but only if we act correctly and document everything properly. The good news is that you're in a stronger position than you probably realize." He explained the revocable living trust first. Under North Carolina law, I could transfer the property into a trust, the Raymond L. Gardner Revocable Living Trust, in which I would remain the sole trustee and sole beneficiary for my lifetime. The house would still be mine in every practical sense. I could revoke the trust or amend it at any time. But the transfer would formalize the ownership structure in a way that made any subsequent claim by a third party significantly harder to pursue. It was, he said, simply good estate, planning the kind of thing people in my position should have done years ago, regardless of any family complications. "Think of it as building a wall," he said. "Not to keep anyone out right now, to make clear permanently and on record where the property line is." I told him I understood property lines. Then he explained the right of occupancy agreement, a formal document signed by me as the sole property owner, granting Brandon and Nicole Gardner permission to reside at 1847 Ridgecrest Drive on a month-to-month basis, terminable with 60 days written notice, as provided under North Carolina General Statute 42-14. The agreement could be backdated to reflect the actual start of their residency 3 years ago, since that was in fact the accurate date, and would establish legally that their presence in the house had always been at my discretion and not by any right of ownership or tenancy protected under the Redis state's eviction statutes. "If you serve proper notice under this agreement," Hall said, "and they don't vacate within the 60-day period, you have a clean legal basis for summary ejectment proceedings. No ambiguity, no argument about implied tenancy rights." "How long to prepare both documents?" "A week, possibly 10 days. I'll need a copy of the current deed and the photograph of that document they showed you. I can have both to you this afternoon." He wrote a figure on the notepad, tore off the page, and slid it across the desk. $3,200 for the trust preparation, deed transfer filing with the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds, and the occupancy agreement. I read the number, folded the paper, and put it in my jacket pocket. "One question," I said. "If someone with legal expertise, a family attorney, say 30 years of practice, were to review these documents after the fact and look for ways to challenge them, how would they hold up?" Hall's expression didn't change. "A properly executed revocable living trust with a notarized deed transfer and a right of occupancy agreement with accurate dates and a sole owner's signature." He picked up his pen. "About as well as any document I prepare. Which is to say, very well." I stood and buttoned my jacket. Hall stood too. "One more thing," he said. "Do you want to sign after Christmas or before?" I picked up my coat from the chair beside me. "Before," I said. He nodded. He already had his calendar open. I took the elevator down. Outside on South Tryon Street, the December air was cold and clear. The kind of clarity that comes right before something changes. I walked to my car, sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, and thought about nothing in particular. Then I drove home. That evening, Brandon and Nicole were in the living room when I came in. Nicole was on the phone, something about table linens for the dinner, and Brandon was watching a game on the television I had bought 11 years ago, and which Nicole had twice suggested replacing because it didn't fit the aesthetic. Neither of them looked up when I came through the door. I hung my coat on the hook in the entryway, the hook I had installed myself, and went upstairs to my study. I found the copy of the deed in the fireproof safe. I photographed the partial ownership document from the folder where I'd kept it. I sent both to Timothy Hall's office email before 9:00. Then I went to the workshop. The picture frame was nearly finished. I ran my thumb along the inside corner of the joint and felt it smooth tight, not a fraction of give. I set it down and turned off the light. A week before Christmas, Hall's assistant called to tell me the documents were ready for my signature. I said I'd be there the next morning. Then I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching the backyard, bare trees, gray sky, the workshop at the far edge of the driveway, and thought about the fact that in 24 hours, everything about my position would be different, even though nothing anyone could see would have changed at all. That's the thing about paperwork. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits there precise and silent until the moment it matters. I was at Hall's office by 9:00. He had both documents laid out on his conference table, the trust instrument and the right of occupancy agreement, each tabbed for signature. He walked me through them methodically. The trust named me as both grantor and trustee, with a successor trustee designation I could update at any time. The property transfer was formalized via a new deed to be filed with the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. The occupancy agreement set out the terms clearly month-to-month basis, terminable with 60 days written. Notice no rights of ownership or equity interest created by the occupancy. The premises to be returned in their original condition upon termination. The date of commencement on the occupancy agreement reflected the actual date Brandon and Nicole had moved in. 3 years ago. Accurate, documented, unambiguous. I signed where I was told to sign. Hall signed as a witness. He gave me 2 certified copies of each document and kept the originals for his file. The deed transfer will be filed with the county by end of week, he said. After that, the property is formally held in trust. I thanked him, collected my copies, and took the elevator down. From South Tryon Street, I drove directly to Providence Road and the office of Karen Simpson, a notary public whose name Hall had mentioned as someone he worked with regularly. Her office was small and efficient, a desk, a state seal on the wall. The kind of place where serious things happen without ceremony. She notarized my signature on the trust documents in 12 minutes, charged me $40 and wished me a good day. I drove back through Charlotte with the documents in a manila envelope on the passenger seat. The city looked the same as it always did. Nothing on the outside had changed. That was exactly how I wanted it. There was one more thing I wanted to know, and it wasn't strictly necessary. But I am by training, and by habit, someone who believes in understanding the full scope of what he's working with before making any decisions. I called the number for Sherry Clark, a real estate agent whose name I'd seen on a few listing signs in the neighborhood. She answered on the second ring and agreed to meet me for coffee that afternoon near the Dilworth neighborhood. She was professional and direct, which I respected. I told her I wasn't planning to list the property, but that I wanted to understand current market conditions on Ridgecrest Drive specifically. Honestly, it's a strong market right now, she said. She pulled out a tablet and showed me 3 recent comparables. Sales within a quarter-mile radius over the past 4 months. The numbers ranged from $880,000 to $962,000. My property, she said, with its lot size and detached structure, would likely come in at the higher end of that range if listed in spring. I thanked her, said I'd be in touch if circumstances changed, and left her my card. Driving home, I turned that number over in my mind. Not because I intended to sell. I had no such intention. But there is something clarifying about knowing the exact value of what you're protecting. It has a weight, a specificity. It makes the whole enterprise feel less abstract. That evening, Nicole was in full Christmas preparation mode. She'd ordered flowers, a large arrangement that was now sitting on the dining room table, which meant there was no longer room for the centerpiece I'd had there for 15 years. A piece of hand-turned walnut bowl my father had made. One woman I didn't recognize looked uncertain for half a second. Brandon's eyes went to the tablecloth. Daniel Whitfield raised his glass toward his daughter and smiled. I didn't move. I looked at Nicole for 5 seconds. Not at the room, not at Brandon, not at Daniel. At Nicole. She held my gaze with the confidence of someone who has just said the thing she has wanted to say for a long time and believes there will be no consequences. Then I said quietly, without raising my voice, the way you say something you mean for exactly one person to hear, even in a full room. That's a good toast, Nicole. Remember this evening. She laughed again, louder this time. I planned to, she said, and turned back to her guests. I picked up my fork. I finished what was on my plate. I folded my napkin, set it beside the dish, pushed back my chair, and stood. Excuse me, I said to no one in particular. I walked out of the dining room and up the stairs. Behind me, the conversation resumed. A comment from Daniel, laughter from the table. Nicole's voice carrying over it all with the ease of a woman in her own home. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My house, my table, my crystal, my walnut bowl on the credenza in the hallway because there wasn't space for it in the room she had arranged. I sat for several minutes. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger is hot and imprecise. What I felt was the opposite. A cold, clear, settling like a level. Finally reading true after a long time. Slightly off. Everything was in order. The documents were signed. The trust was filed. The occupancy agreement was in Hall's file and in my safe. He had a slot open 2 days from now. I got up, went to the window and looked out at the driveway. The workshop light was off. The neighborhood was quiet. I went to bed. I slept better than I had in months. I was awake before 6:30. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and looked at the backyard while the house was still quiet. The Christmas tree was still lit in the corner of the living room. Nicole had put it up 2 weeks ago with lights she'd bought and ornaments she'd selected, including several that had belonged to my family for decades. I hadn't objected. I'd watched her unwrap them from tissue paper in the storage box with the care of a person who believes she is handling her own things. I looked at the tree for a moment. Then I looked out at the workshop at the far end of the driveway. Its roof white from the overnight frost. Then I picked up my phone and called Timothy Hall. His assistant answered. I told her I needed to come in that morning, the next step we had discussed, and that I'd be there by 9:00. She confirmed the appointment in under a minute. I finished my coffee. I dressed, came back downstairs, put on my coat, picked up my keys and left. Hall met me at the conference room door. The notice of termination of occupancy was already on the table. 2 pages. I read through them the way I read every document from the beginning, every line. The notice identified the property at 1847 Ridgecrest Drive named Brandon James Gardner and Nicole N. Gardner as the occupants. Referenced the right of occupancy agreement by its execution date, and provided formal notice of termination effective 60 days from the date of service. Under the agreement's terms and North Carolina General Statute 42-14, no reason was required. No negotiation was implied. 60 days. Last day of February. Vacate the premises. I signed where Hall indicated. He countersigned as attorney of record. His assistant prepared 2 certified mailing envelopes and a set of copies for in-person delivery with signature receipt. How do you want these served? Hall asked. In person, I said. This afternoon. I want a signature. He arranged it. I wrote a check for $850. Preparation and service coordination. Thanked him, collected my copies, and drove home. The drive back took 22 minutes. I kept the radio off. I had nothing I needed to think through anymore. The thinking was done. The documents were signed. The next steps were in motion. What I had now was simply the particular quiet of a man who has finished a long piece of work correctly. When I arrived, Nicole's car was in the driveway. I went inside, hung up my coat, went to the kitchen. She was at the counter with a coffee mug and her phone still in her robe. She looked up briefly. You were up early, she said. Errands, I said. I poured a second coffee and sat at the kitchen table. She went back to her phone. I read through my certified copies one more time. Slowly, the way you read something you want to be completely certain you have right. The language was clean. The dates were accurate. The statute references were correct. 60 days from today's date. Last day of February. Vacate the premises in their original condition. I folded the copies and went upstairs to the safe. At 2:05 the doorbell rang. I was in the study. I heard Nicole's footsteps cross the hallway. I heard the door open. The brief professional exchange of Hall's assistant's voice and Nicole's uncertain response. Then silence. Then the door closing. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. Nicole appeared in the doorway of the study. She was holding a large manila envelope with her name printed on the label. Nicole Ann Gardner, 1847 Ridgecrest Drive. And below it in clear block letters, official legal notice. She was looking at me. Her face had done something interesting. The permanent, settled confidence that lived there, the smooth certainty I had watched operate for 3 years had shifted. Not collapsed. Not yet. But it had cracked at the edges. The way a wall does before it fails. The first hairline fractures running through the surface. The structure still standing, but something fundamentally changed in the load it was carrying. She was still calculating. I could see it. the eyes moving slightly, the jaw set. The quick internal inventory of the situation. She was trying to identify what this was. A misunderstanding, perhaps. Something administrative. Something that could be managed with a phone call and the right tone of voice. She was still in the mode where she was the one who managed things, but her hands had tightened on the envelope in a way that was not casual. The knuckles were pale against the manila paper. That detail, small as it was, told me everything about what she understood on some level that her mind hadn't caught up with yet. "What is this?" she said. Her voice was careful, controlled. But it had dropped half a register from its usual register. "Open it," I said. She didn't move. "Raymond," same careful tone, with a thin wire of something new underneath. Not alarm exactly, but the precursor to it. "What is in this envelope?" "Your name is on it," I said. "It's addressed to you." We looked at each other across the study. The afternoon light came through the window, the way it always did at this hour, falling across my desk, my bookshelves, the reading chair, the original one which I had moved back to its correct position by the window weeks ago, and which had stayed there. My house, my study, my light. Nicole looked down at the envelope. When she looked back up, the calculation in her eyes had given way to something different. Not fear, not quite. She was too controlled for that to break through so quickly. But certainty had left her face. The expression of a woman who walks into a room fully expecting to own it and finds for the first time that the room has different ideas. For the first time in 3 years, standing in the doorway of the study she had treated as part of her own home, she was not sure what kind of man she was dealing with. I turned back to the book I'd been reading. "Take your time," I said. I heard her footsteps withdraw down the hallway. Then the low, urgent sound of her voice on the phone. Careful words, short sentences. The tone of a person delivering information that requires an immediate response. She was calling Daniel. Daniel Whitfield, the most successful attorney in Charlotte, was going to have a very interesting afternoon. I turned a page and kept reading. Nicole read the notice that evening. I know this because I heard her. Not the words, "The walls are solid in a house built to last," but the sound of it. A single sharp intake of breath, then silence, then her footsteps moving quickly across the floor above me. Then her voice again, low and urgent, and the particular quality of a phone call where the person on the other end is an ally and not merely a listener. She was calling her father. I was in the study with a book I wasn't reading. I had made tea, which I don't particularly like because making tea gives you something to do with your hands during the kind of evening that requires patience more than action. I sat and I waited and I drank the tea, and I turned pages without absorbing any of them. And at 7:43 I heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Daniel Whitfield's sedan. I recognized the engine. I closed the book, set down my cup, and walked to the front room. Through the window I watched him come up the path. Jacket, no tie, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who has been told there is a problem and has decided he is the solution. He rang the bell. I waited 4 seconds before I answered. "Daniel," I said. "Raymond." He stepped past me into the entryway without being invited. "That was interesting. We need to talk." "I'm sure we do," I said. I closed the door. Living room. Nicole was already there, standing near the fireplace with her arms crossed and the notice in her hand. Brandon was on the couch. He'd come home an hour ago, and I had heard him and Nicole talking in the bedroom for 30 minutes before Daniel arrived. He looked the way he'd looked during the dinner the night before. Uncomfortable. Reluctant to be where he was. Unable to figure out how to be anywhere else. Daniel Whitfield stood in the center of the room and turned to face me. He had composed himself on the way up the path. The urgency was still there underneath, but the surface was the practiced calm of a man who has spent 3 decades controlling difficult conversations from the outset. "You cannot evict your own son," he said. "This property has been their shared home for 3 years. Brandon has rights here. Any court in North Carolina will recognize an implied tenancy claim regardless of what documents you filed." He said it with conviction. He said it the way he probably said most things in his professional life, as a statement of conclusion rather than an opening of discussion, expecting the other person to absorb it and adjust accordingly. I walked to the writing desk against the wall and opened the top drawer. I had put the copies there that morning when I came home from Hall's office. Not in the safe, not in a folder, but right there in the top drawer, easy to reach. I had been expecting this conversation. I took out 2 documents and set them on the coffee table in front of Daniel. The revocable living trust instrument, the right of occupancy agreement with its execution date and its terms and its clear, unambiguous reference to North Carolina General Statute 42-14. Sit down, I said. Read them. Daniel looked at the documents. He looked at me. Then he picked them up. The room was quiet while he read. Nicole watched him with the particular anxiety of someone who has placed a large bet and is watching the result come in. Brandon looked at the floor. I stood by the window and waited. Daniel read slowly. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He went through both documents from the beginning, including the signature pages, the notarization stamps, and the date of registration with the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. When he finished, he set them down on the coffee table and was quiet for a moment. The confidence on his face had not disappeared, but something had shifted in it. A recalibration, the internal adjustment of a man who has encountered something he did not anticipate and is now deciding how to proceed. This can be challenged, he said. Try, I said. The word landed flat. No heat, no invitation, just a door held open to a path he was welcome to take. Brandon stood up then. I hadn't seen him standing since before the dinner, and the movement surprised me. His face was red in the way that Brandon's face had always gotten red when he was working himself towards something he didn't want to say. Dad. His voice was strained. You can't do this. This is our home. You're throwing us out like we're strangers. I looked at my son. He was 37 years old, standing in my living room telling me I was throwing him out of his home. The word "our" sat in the room between us like something that had been dropped. Brandon, I said. When was the last time you asked me how I was? He blinked. What? Not about the house. Not about dinner plans or the thermostat or whether I'd seen a package that was delivered. Just how I was. When did that happen? He didn't answer. You could have talked to me, I said. Any time in the last 3 years. You could have come to the workshop, sat down, said, Dad, I think there's a problem here. I would have listened. I always listened. I kept my voice even. You chose not to. Every time you chose not to. Brandon opened his mouth. He closed it again. Daniel Whitfield picked up the copies from the coffee table. I'll have my office review these in the morning, he said. His voice was controlled, professional. Don't consider this settled. I don't consider anything I said. The documents do. He left. Nicole followed him out to the car. Brandon stood in the living room for another moment, looking at the space where his father-in-law had been, then went upstairs without a word. I picked up my tea, which was cold by now, and carried it to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and looked out at the workshop in the dark. Daniel Whitfield was going to look for a weakness. That was the next move. And I had known it was coming since the moment I first understood what the document in Nicole's folder had been. 30 years of estate and family law. He would be methodical, and he would be thorough, and he would find something to work with, or he would manufacture the appearance of something. But I had been thorough first. I poured the cold tea down the drain and went to bed. 3 weeks passed. The house during those weeks had the atmosphere of a building that has been condemned and not yet vacated. Everyone aware of the timeline, no one discussing it directly. Nicole was correct and distant. Brandon moved through the rooms carefully, like a man afraid to knock over anything else. I made my coffee in the mornings, went to the workshop in the afternoons, and ate dinner alone because Nicole had started preparing their meals separately and taking them upstairs. I did not find this unbearable. I found it quiet. Then Hall called. Daniel Whitfield has filed a civil complaint in Mecklenburg County Superior Court, he said. Unjust enrichment claim on behalf of Brandon Gardner. The argument is that your son contributed approximately $18 0 home improvement work during his 3-year residency and that the termination of his occupancy without compensation constitutes unjust enrichment to the property owner. He sat down at my desk. How strong is it? As a theory, it's legitimate under North Carolina law. As applied to your specific situation, it depends entirely on the evidence. Hall's voice was measured. I need you to come in. Bring everything you have. Bank records, receipts, any records of household payments, or expenses for the past 3 years. Everything. I was in his office the following morning with a box of files. I had kept records. This is not a habit I developed in response to Brandon and Nicole moving in. It is simply how I have lived since I was 32 years old. And a contractor submitted an invoice for work that had never been performed. Since then, I have kept receipts, bank statements, expense logs. It's not suspicion. It's architecture. You document what you build. Hall spent 2 hours going through the box with his paralegal. I sat in the conference room and drank the coffee his assistant brought and waited. When he came back, he set a yellow legal pad on the table. He had made 3 columns of numbers. Of the $18,000 Whitfield claims Brandon spent on home improvements, Hall said, I found documentation showing that $14,200 came directly from your accounts. A bathroom renovation you paid the contractor. Exterior painting your check. The kitchen cabinet hardware, your card transaction. Brandon may have initiated some of these projects, but you funded them. He picked out the hardware, I said. That's not the same as paying for it. Hall moved to the second column. The remaining $3,800 is genuinely Brandon's expenditure. Some landscaping work he arranged and paid for independently, and a ceiling fan installation. He paused. That's the number they can actually work with. $3,800 against an unjust enrichment claim is not a strong case. He tapped the third column. This is what changes the calculation entirely. Your utility payments for the property over the past 3 years. Electric, gas, water, internet. I averaged your monthly costs at approximately $2,800. Over 36 months, that's $100. $800 you paid in operating costs, while Brandon and Nicole contributed $0 toward household expenses. I looked at the number. Ibaime and Babe. Whitfield is claiming unjust enrichment on your part, Hall said. But if we present your utility payment record as a countervailing benefit conferred on Brandon and Nicole, free housing with all utilities included, the net enrichment runs strongly in the opposite direction. The judge will see a man who received 3 years of rent-free, utility-free accommodation and is now claiming compensation for interior improvements that were largely funded by the property owner. File the response, I said. Hall filed it. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, the 60-day notice period continued to run. Daniel Whitfield, I learned through Hall, had attempted to argue that the filing of the civil complaint should pause the eviction timeline. The court declined to grant a stay. The clock kept moving. The day before the hearing, Nicole came to the workshop. She stood in the doorway. She had never been there before in 3 years and looked at the workbench and tools and the half-finished maple box under the lamp. Something in her expression was different. Not the calculating look, not the pleasantness for company, more unguarded. My father is very good at what he does, she said. I'm sure he is, I said. I kept sanding. He doesn't lose. I set down the sandpaper and looked at her. She was standing very straight, the way people stand when trying to appear more certain than they feel. Nicole, I said, he's arguing a case where the facts don't support the claim and he knows it. He filed because he thought I'd settle to avoid the trouble. I picked the sandpaper back up. I don't settle to avoid trouble. I document and I wait. She looked at me for a moment, then she walked back to the house. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Hall presented the expense documentation and the utility payment records. Whitfield argued that Brandon's contributions should be valued at the improved market rate of the property rather than the actual cost. The judge, a matter-of-fact woman who had been on the Mecklenburg County Superior Court bench for 11 years, listened to both sides, reviewed the submitted exhibits, and issued her ruling from the bench. Motion denied. Complaint dismissed. Daniel Whitfield's legal fees for the action $6,400. His. I sat in the gallery and watched him gather his papers from the plaintiff's table. He was precise about it. He stacked them carefully, slid them into his briefcase, and closed the clasp with 2 deliberate clicks. He didn't look in my direction. Nicole, who had been sitting 2 rows ahead of me, stood and turned. For a fraction of a second before the control reasserted itself, I saw something on her face that I had not seen there before. Fear, not of me exactly, of the situation. Of the ground she had assumed was stable, proving to be something else entirely. The expression lasted perhaps 2 seconds before she put her face back in order and walked out of the courtroom behind her father. I sat for a moment in the now empty gallery. The courtroom was quiet. The afternoon light came through the high windows at an angle that reminded me for no reason in particular of the light in a building I had designed a long time ago. A public library in Concord. Finished on time. Still standing. I picked up my jacket and walked out. The morning of the deadline arrived the way most consequential mornings do. Quietly, without announcement, looking exactly like any other day. I was up at 6:00. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the light come up over the backyard. The workshop roof had a thin skin of frost on it. The neighborhood was still. I had slept well, which I without surprise. I had been sleeping well for weeks. By 7:30, Brandon and Nicole had begun moving things downstairs. I stayed out of the way. I took my coffee to the study, sat at my desk, and opened the book I'd been working through. A history of American property law that I had started partly out of professional curiosity and partly because Timothy Hall had mentioned it during our first meeting and I had been meaning to read it for years. I read for 2 hours. I heard the sound of boxes being carried, furniture being shifted, the low exchange of voices from the floor below. At 10:00, I went to the kitchen to pour a second cup. Nicole was standing at the counter with her back to me, wrapping something in newspaper. The set of cocktail glasses I had bought for the house before she and Brandon moved in. I stopped in the doorway. "Those aren't yours," I said. She turned. Her expression was the one she'd been wearing since the court ruling. Controlled but thinner than it used to be, the pleasantness stripped away to something more functional and less convincing. "Brandon said they were ours," she said. "Brandon was mistaken," I said. I crossed to the counter and took the glasses from the newspaper without raising my voice. "The glasses stay." She looked at me for a moment. Then she picked up a different box and walked out of the kitchen. I put the glasses back in the cabinet where they had always been. At noon, I walked through the house with my phone and photographed every room. The walls where the 2 oil paintings had hung a pair of Charlotte landscapes I'd given Brandon for his 30th birthday were bare. I noted this. I photographed the empty spaces in the walls and the kitchen where the standing mixer that had been mine since before they arrived was also gone. I went to the garage and confirmed that the spare key to the workshop lock was missing from the hook beside the door. I called Hall from the driveway while Brandon was loading the last boxes into the moving van they'd rented. 3 items, I said. 2 paintings approximately 14 by 18 inches each, oil on canvas. Charlotte landscapes value approximately $900 each, based on the artist's current market. 1 KitchenAid stand mixer, retail value $840, mine prior to their occupancy. And the spare workshop key. I paused. "I want a demand letter out by end of week." "I'll have it ready Thursday," Hall said. Brandon came out of the house carrying a duffel bag. He stopped when he saw me on the phone. I held up a hand. "One moment," and finished the call. Then I put the phone in my pocket and looked at my son. He looked the way he'd looked at 18. The summer he'd crashed my car and come to tell me about it. Braced for impact, carrying the weight of something he knew was coming and couldn't stop. He was 37 years old, and he looked exactly the same. "Dad," he said, "the paintings were mine. You gave them to me." "I gave them to you," I said, "not to your household, not to Nicole. To you. If they're going to live somewhere other than this house, I want to be asked first." He was quiet for a moment. "She took them," he said finally. His voice was flat. "I didn't ask her to." I looked at him. He meant it, I could tell. That was the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years in a marriage where things happened around him that he hadn't asked for and hadn't stopped. "Then make sure they come back," I said, with everything else. He nodded once. He put the duffel in the van. Nicole came out of the front door with the last box, walked past me without speaking, and got into the passenger seat without looking back at the house. The van pulled out of the driveway. I stood on the front path and watched it go. Then I went inside, walked through every room one more time, and unlocked the workshop with my primary key. A week later, Hall sent the demand letter. The value of the items: 2 paintings at $900 each, 1 mixer at $840 plus the workshop key replacement cost. Total. 2,740. Return the property within 14 days or remit the full amount. The paintings came back within a week, delivered by Brandon in his own car, wrapped in the same newspaper Nicole had been using when she tried to take the cocktail glasses. He set them down in the entryway without coming inside. The mixer did not come back. I filed in small claims court. The filing fee was $65. The hearing was scheduled 5 weeks out. Nicole did not appear. She sent a written response claiming the mixer had been a household gift. The judge, a patient man who had heard a great many variations on this argument, reviewed the documentation I submitted. The original purchase receipt from 6 years ago in my name, predating Brandon and Nicole's residency by 3 years. He ruled in my favor. $2,740 plus $180 in court costs. I deposited the check when it arrived. I didn't celebrate. I filed the receipt in the folder with the other documents and put it back in the safe. That evening my phone rang. I looked at the screen. "Brandon," I answered. "Dad." His voice was careful the way it had been the night he stood in the living room, and I asked him when he'd last asked how I was. "I'm sorry. I should have. I should have handled things differently a long time ago." I sat with that for a moment. "I know," I said. "The door isn't closed, Brandon, but the terms are mine now." He was quiet. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." We didn't say much. We didn't need to. I hung up and sat in the study for a while in the quiet of a house that was for the first time in 3 years entirely my own. Several months later, I met Brandon for lunch at a diner on Providence Road. We had been doing this every 2 weeks. Neutral ground, no agenda, just coffee and whatever we felt like talking about. The first few meetings had been careful measured. We were two people learning again how to be in the same room without the architecture of someone else's expectations between us. It took time. That was fine. I had learned over a long career and a longer life that the things worth building take time. That afternoon, Brandon told me about Nicole. She had filed for divorce 6 weeks after the court ruling, citing irreconcilable differences. The proceedings were underway. He wasn't asking me for sympathy, and I didn't offer any. I just listened the way you listen when someone is sorting through something difficult and needs the sorting more than they need an audience. Then he told me about her father. Daniel Whitfield's legal costs for the unjust enrichment claim had come to $6,400. His own money. Nicole wasn't in a position to cover it, and apparently she hadn't tried. Within the local legal community in Charlotte, the story had circulated. It was the kind of story that circulates. A 30-year estate attorney who took a case against a retired property owner and lost on the merits cleanly in open court. His colleagues knew. His clients asked questions. The reputation that had been built over decades, the one that Daniel had raised his daughter on, the one that had sat at the head of my Christmas table and accepted toasts to its own success, had developed a crack, not a collapse. Daniel Whitfield was still practicing, still billing, still the man in the room who made certain everyone knew what he'd accomplished. But a crack is a crack. A structure that has one is no longer the same structure. Brandon told me this without pleasure and without malice. He was simply reporting what he knew. I listened without comment. When lunch was over, I drove home. I turned onto Ridgecrest Drive and pulled into the driveway at 1847. I sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the house. Colonial construction, 4 bedrooms, the detached garage at the end of the drive. The November light was flat and clear, the kind of light that shows you exactly what things are. I had designed dozens of buildings in my career. Commercial structures mostly. Office parks, community spaces, a library, a medical center. The ones I was proudest of were not the most complex or the most expensive. They were the ones that still stood exactly as designed 20 or 30 years later, because the foundation had been right and the materials had been honest, and no one had cut corners on the parts that couldn't be seen. This house was mine. The deed said Raymond L. Gardner Revocable Living Trust. The documents were in order. The trust was sound. No one else's name was on any piece of paper that mattered. I went to the workshop. I had been building the small box maple-jointed corners, no hardware, a simple sliding lid. It was the kind of project I liked. No client, no deadline, just the material and the problem of making it correctly. I had been working on it in pieces over the past 2 months between everything else, and it was nearly finished. I set it on the bench under the lamp and looked at it. The joints were tight. The surface was smooth. The lid moved cleanly in its groove without binding. I ran my thumb along the corner where 2 pieces met and felt the seam. Barely there the way a good joint should be. I went back to the house and found the photograph. It was still in the dining room on the sideboard. One of the pictures Nicole had taken during the Christmas dinner, printed and framed sometime in the weeks before everything changed. 12 people at the table, candles lit flower arrangement in the center, and at the far end beside the coat rack, a man in a chair slightly apart from the rest of the gathering, looking at something out of frame. I looked at the photograph for a while. Then I carried it to the workshop and set it on the bench beside the box. I thought about Nicole standing where I was standing in this same workshop the afternoon before the court hearing, trying to warn me, trying maybe to read me. Still calculating even then, even when the calculation had already run out. I thought about Daniel Whitfield closing his briefcase with 2 deliberate clicks and not looking in my direction. I thought about Brandon on the phone, voice careful. "I'm sorry. I should have handled things differently." I thought about a toast delivered with a raised glass and a smile that expected no response. Just our old servant. I opened the bottom drawer of the workbench, the deep one where I keep hardware and miscellaneous things that don't have a better place, and I put the photograph inside. Face down, I closed the drawer. I did not need it anymore. Whatever it had been meant to prove to me to anyone had been settled by documents and court records and 60 days' notice and a small claims ruling and a $2,740 check that cleared without incident. The photograph was just paper now. I picked up the maple box and turned it in my hands under the lamp. It was finished. It had turned out well. I crossed to the window and pushed it open. The November air came in cold and clean, carrying the smell of the neighborhood. Dead leaves, distant smoke, and underneath it all the particular dry scent of cut wood that had been part of this workshop since the day I built the bench. I set the box down, pulled up the stool, and sat by the open window. The house was quiet. The street was quiet. The trust document in the safe upstairs named me as sole trustee and sole beneficiary of the property at 1847 Ridgecrest Drive. The Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds had a record that would outlast anyone currently standing on this street. The documents were in order. I was 68 years old, retired, living in a house I had protected through patience and paperwork and the refusal to be managed. Not a servant. Not a piece of furniture that could be moved to the corner when it wasn't needed. The owner. Which is what I'd always been, even when someone at my own table had raised a glass and said otherwise. The November air smelled like wood and something close to peace. I sat by the open window and let it come in. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to several stories there. You will find a link to it in the collaboration or description of this video or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel will soon cease to exist.